Hey everybody, welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition podcast. This is alexsachon, and today we're going to be picking back up with our series on America called America, Land of the Feathered Serpent. And this is going to be part 3 of an overall, I think it's going to be 6 parts, an overall series that's on the deep, meaning ancient and occult history of America. And the title of this current article, again, this being part 3 of the series, it's called America's Place in World History. And actually, at the end of the last episode, I stated that it was going to be called America is the New Atlantis. So that's sort of like a secondary title, you can think of it. But the title, once again, America's Place in World History. So this is kind of a long one. This is a bit of an epic one. There's multi-parts to it. I would say there's 3 main levels. So at first, we're going to go back over, as we've done in each of the articles of this series, we're going to go back over the theme of the cycle of the Arya. But again, we're going to look at it, as we've done the previous times, look at it from a slightly different angle each time. But this is one of the central motifs of this overall book project that I'm doing. It's called Philosophy as Origin, Purpose, and Destiny. It's also one of the fundamental components of the esoteric teachings, particularly those of Blavatsky and Manly Hall. This idea that there are cycles to the evolutionary development of mankind, and that Atlantis represented a previous cycle, and our current cycle is called the Arya, or the Aryan cycle, and that has succeeded the Atlantean cycle. So to understand world history and the transition of ages from Atlantis to today, and to really understand philosophically what Atlantis means, we have to understand this idea about these larger cycles that take place, and this idea about evolution taking place sequentially over the course of time, with sort of a reincarnation theme prominently emphasized. And then, having introduced this Aryan cycle, we're going to focus it in and look at America as a particular case study, or a particular region that has a role to play in the unfoldment of this larger phase of human history. And then we're going to go into a case study then to explore some of these themes that we're introducing in this first part. We're going to do a case study, and that case study is going to be the second main body of this article, and that's going to be on the Inca. So the Inca was a civilization that arose in Peru. They had certain similarities to the Mayan civilization that we talked about already in this series, but we're going to be looking at the Inca and looking at what's unique about them and how they interface with this larger concept of the Aryan cycle, the Aryan root race, and the sort of what that means in terms of the evolution of man and the evolution of civilization, and certain themes and patterns that we see emerging over time within civilization. These are things that we're going to discuss in relation to this topic of the Inca. And then in the third part of this, we're going to kind of zoom out and explore some of the themes that we introduced in our discussion of the Inca. And these are going to concern the difference between race and nation. And this is a discussion I've had already on this podcast a couple years ago. Like towards the beginning, I had an article called From Race to Nation that was based on a section on the publication on Atlantis called Atlantis and the Origins of Civilization. That was the first publication I put together, and I did a little series of podcasts on that publication back when I put it out. So I do have an episode, and there is a section in that zine on this theme of a transition from race, a racial concept, to a national concept in terms of human society, the growth and evolution of human civilization. And so this is a theme that we're going to be going back into and exploring in detail in the third part of this article. So that's what's in store for today. I hope you all will stick with the episode. It's a really good one and is important in terms of setting up themes that we're going to be discussing in the future, in the next several episodes and in the last couple chapters of this book project. So once again, my website is alexsachon.com. I have links to the whole series of articles and publications and episodes that I've been doing on this book project over the past year. Actually, it's been a little bit over a year now since I've started it, but it is once again called Philosophy as Origin, Purpose, and Destiny. So see the website for more information on that, and then you can also find a link to my e-store and to the podcast and to the YouTube channel. So let's get into it now. This third article, it's called, once again, America's Place in World History. And the first section is called The Cycle of the Arya and the Quest for the New Atlantis. A theme that we've discussed numerous times over the course of this whole book project, and also in this chapter even, but we're going to go back over it again and look at it and probe this main theme for some new angles, and then we're going to develop those over the course of the article. So yeah, stay tuned. All right, kicking things off with section 1. Once again, this is called The Cycle of the Arya and the Quest for the New Atlantis. This is going to be overviewing the main themes of this Aryan stage of human evolution. In the thinking of esoteric philosophy, Atlantis represents not just a lost antediluvian age of world civilization, but also a lost evolutionary stage of human history, a missing link between modern man and the prehistoric cavemen and hunter-gatherer tribes of the Stone Age. Manly Hall explains that, quote, the Atlanteans were a world civilization covering all parts of our globe. Their name was taken from the particular continent which was the center of their power, an island nation that once occupied space in the Atlantic Ocean between America and Europe. According to the esoteric tradition, the heyday of this lost age of civilization lasted for millions of years. During this expansive period of time, it experienced numerous rises and falls, with golden ages coming and going in response to the oscillating tides of great cosmic cycles. These greater cosmic cycles are pulling mankind gradually but inevitably toward the fulfillment of its ultimate collective destiny. As part of the grand evolutionary plan of the cosmos, mankind is intended to pass through 7 core developmental stages, which are termed root races in esoteric philosophy. The Atlantean cycle formed one of these 7 developmental phases, one that all humans collectively went through together at a certain point in time. Now, we collectively exist as part of a new evolutionary stage of human development, with this new cycle termed the Arya or Aryan Age. The so-called Aryan root race, the one that succeeded the Atlantean, represents the 5th of 7 root races in mankind's developmental pathway. This is the human form that has come into existence during the course of the Aryan Age. The Aryan root race is the one currently existing in the world. All humans today are a part of it regardless of ethnicity. This current root race first emerged before the previous Atlantean cycle had officially ended, implying that, for an extended period, both root races occupied the Earth concurrently. Describing the origin of the Arya, Manly Hall explains that, quote, about 1 million years before the beginning of the Christian era, the Aryan migrations began in North Central Asia. From the Great Gobi Desert in Mongolia, there emerged the beginning of our race, destined gradually to come into domination all over the face of the Earth. As explained in part 1 of this chapter, and also in numerous other articles of this book, the Aryan root race began when a racial spirit termed the Manu oversold a nomadic band of migrants who had escaped the Atlantean capital city and taken refuge in a secluded region near the Himalayas. The Manu incarnated through this group in order to establish the vibratory archetype of the new root race. After establishing this archetype, all human souls on Earth were destined to evolve toward a realization of it. It represents an ideal soul pattern that each human soul moving through the Aryan age of world evolution will one day evolve to become a perfect expression of. The soul archetype, or the Aryan soul archetype, was first exemplified through the incarnation of the Manu's 7 Rishi, the 7 master teachers who serve as the first enlightened spiritual sages of the new race. These 7 sages, who together manifest the will of the Manu, oversold a select group of advanced individuals drawn from the migrating band of Atlantean peoples who had moved into the Himalayan region. These individuals became the first initiates of the Aryan mystery school, with the 7 Rishi descended from the Manu serving as their spiritual masters and guides. This line of enlightened spiritual teachers, termed adepts, became enlightened by shaping their soul pattern into the design of the archetype originally personified by the 7 Rishi. These adepts together formed a mystery school called the Institutes of Manu, and within this school, further initiates were raised up to embody, or to also embody, the Aryan soul pattern, or the Aryan archetype. As the initiates of the school shaped and molded their souls into the archetypal pattern of the Manu, they graduated into higher and higher degrees of the Aryan initiation system. Beneath them, lesser disciples and students were trained, with the higher initiates serving as the teachers of the lesser disciples. In this way, the Aryan mystery school, the foundation of the Aryan root race, began here on Earth. That's an important point to note, that the whole race begins with the existence of this mystery school. And it's the work of this mystery school gradually moving around the Earth, and that's what moves in and shapes and transforms the remnant Atlantean societies that they encountered, or the remnant Atlantean cultures and peoples. So through that method, that's how this Aryan root race pattern emerges. It's not one people coming out of a central place and displacing everybody else. It's really a pattern, a soul pattern that begins in a certain place and moves outward gradually around the world. But this pattern moves out into the world. The so-called Aryan migrations are really the migrations of these teachers, these spiritual teachers, and the mystery schools that they founded, and how these were all linked together. So that's sort of the key. So from this point on, the point of the foundation of the Aryan mystery school, then from that point on, the age of Atlantis was fated to end, with all human souls henceforth required to gradually move out of the Atlantean form and to reincarnate into the new Aryan one. Occupying an Aryan form, the human soul would be given an opportunity to release and perfect powers and potentials previously held latent within it during the Atlantean stage of its development. While the beginning of the Arya began as far back as 1 million years ago, the end of the Atlantean cycle is usually marked at the point of the last deluge, which took place approximately around 9600 BC. The considerable time difference between the point of the last deluge and the earlier point when the Aryan root race first began here on Earth through the incarnation of the Manu implies that both root races existed at the same time on this planet for an extended period of time. At first, they met as competitors, with the Atlantean Empire sending a war party against the Aryans at the time when the Great Deluge of 10,000 BC took place. But eventually, after the fall of the Empire's home island and the scattering of its remnant groups, competition between the two for the most part ended, with the Aryans peacefully moving into the remnant Atlantean communities and gradually transforming them from within. So in this way, through time, the Aryan pattern of life gradually came to replace the old Atlantean model. Today, the Atlantean stage of human history is firmly in the past, with the Aryan root race now dominating world affairs. But while today we are all Aryans, still the unresolved karma of Atlantis lingers on, continually preying upon the developing human soul, inviting it to grow and mature in order to gain the strength to finally overcome its own weaknesses. The 17th century adept Francis Bacon revealed what the final destined end state of the Aryan cycle is supposed to ultimately look like. He called it the New Atlantis. It represents a future golden age, one based on the foundations of the old Atlantean Empire, but with new added elements featured, ones that mankind has developed within itself over the course of a long cycle of growth, stimulated by struggle and strife. Manly Hall declares that the growing pains of human evolution are all part of a greater cycle of necessity. This represents the idea that nature requires mankind to consciously discover and willingly participate in the unfoldment of its own evolutionary development. Nature will not drag mankind unwittingly toward the fulfillment of its evolutionary destiny. Rather, Mother Nature, symbolizing the existence of a divine intelligence guiding the unfoldment of life on Earth, requires mankind to rediscover within itself its own inherent divinity. Based on this discovery, mankind must then self-consciously participate in its own evolutionary growth, moving its focus of attention away from the personal self and toward the service of a collective universal self. Mother Nature has laid out the path that mankind must follow to achieve its destined end, but we must motivate and propel ourselves to actually traverse this path. Only in this way, by willingly directing ourselves toward the achievement of our own completion, will we ever reach the final finish line that God intends for us. This idea is indicative of the whole Aryan approach to its global spread. Its priority is to bring the collective soul of mankind into a new phase of evolutionary development. This collective soul once existed in an Atlantean form, but since the transition of ages began, the job of the Arya has been to bring mankind into a new stage of life experience, which it accomplishes by seeding a new vibrational archetype into the collective human soul. Consequently, the Arya's method of spread has not been to tear down and destroy the native Atlantean peoples they encountered, for the reason that they saw the human soul within the Atlantean peoples as the same human soul that was within them. Hence, they did not want to destroy this soul, but rather catalyze its progression. Therefore, their strategy of expansion was to integrate themselves into the cultures of the remnant Atlantean peoples they encountered and gradually evolve them from within. Understanding that all human souls are really aspects of one soul, the Aryan wisdom teachers descended in successive waves from their birthplace in the remote Himalayas in order to catalyze an evolutionary progression within the collective body of mankind. Where they encountered humans still existing in a fourth root race form of existence, they moved in and planted the seeds for the new modified form that is now associated with the fifth root race. So that's the cycle of the Arya and the quest for the new Atlantis. That's the end of that first section. So next we're going to be moving on to America's place in the cycle of the Arya. That's section 2. All right, next section, America's place in the cycle of the Arya. Manly Hall offers further elaboration on the transition of ages between Atlantis and the Aryan Age in his 1944 article, Ours is the Blessed Land, where he discusses how the westward migrations of the Arya took place over large areas of continental structure inhabited by peoples descended from the previous Atlantean racial tradition. In this article, Hall explains that the Aryan migrations were constantly moving across the face of inhabited land. This migration, like a great wave, moved southward through the trans-Himalayan region and gradually infiltrated the land area occupied by the Atlanteans. The previous great racial distribution, already decadent, their civilization already collapsed. Over the course of a long period of time, the new racial strain passed through Afghanistan, down through Persia, Chaldea, and Egypt, and gradually into the Mediterranean area. And from there it went northward through the Slavonic counties and then onward through Central and Northern Europe. After reaching the shores of the Atlantic, it then passed into the British Isles. Later, through the labors of the westward traveling Aryan missionaries, it would move into the Americas, where it worked to reestablish the line of Quetzalcoatl, the native mystery school of the American continents, first established during Atlantean times. Everywhere this Aryan migration went, it encountered a civilization already old and tradition-bound. Wherever it mingled with this older civilization, the Aryan stock began to blend itself with the older traditions, modifying not only their bloodlines, but also their philosophy, religion, culture, and arts. Here we discover that the Aryans' purpose was not to pass forth a single bloodline or to wipe out an old one. Rather, their aim was to gradually mingle their own native bloodlines with those of the various groups of Atlantean descendants they came across during their migrations. Furthermore, the primary impetus of the Aryan migrations was not to modify the physical form of the Atlantean, but rather to modify its psychological and institutional infrastructure, with the idea that by first changing the mind, a change in the form will consequently result. Following this rationale, the Aryan missionaries concentrated their efforts on progressing the institutions of the remnant Atlantean peoples, moving them into a new design pattern, one that would act upon and stimulate the soul locked within the form, catalyzing it to develop into a new pattern of evolutionary expression. So the idea here is sort of like what we found with the difference between genetics and epigenetics. The idea being that genes don't, genes are like, the idea being that genes are like receptacles that have to be activated by an environmental force acting upon it. And so the epigenetic idea is the idea of this environmental force or a field or a resonance pattern or a vibratory pattern sort of coming in and activating a gene pattern. So the gene pattern directs how the body constructs itself, but the vibration is the thing that directs the gene on how to maneuver. So the two are inseparable from each other. And so based on this idea, the Aryan missionaries focused on changing the epigenetic environment of the former Atlantean peoples. And then once they changed that vibratory pattern within the mind or the psyche, then the physical form gradually changed alongside it. So in this way, you do have a progression in physical form between the Atlantean and the modern Aryan human, but that transformation in form did not take place primarily through the motion of a bloodline that displaced an older bloodline. Rather, it came through a tradition of the mingling of bloodlines, and the physical changes that resulted were a product of not only that mixing of blood, but also the transformation of the psychological environment of the human. So that's important to understand. The root idea for how this works has to do with the relationship between genetics and epigenetics. Genes require environmental stimulation to trigger them into acting. Different patterns of environmental stimuli triggers genes to act in different ways. Based on this concept, the Aryans worked to change the epigenetic environment of the former Atlanteans, with this change in psychological vibration exerting a corresponding effect on the physical form. In this way, the Aryan model of human gradually came into existence around the world. This did not happen with one bloodline coming to displace the rest through genetic determinism. Rather, it took place through a transformation in institutions, with bloodlines actually becoming gradually mixed together and not separated apart. And so one didn't dominate the others, but rather they blended together, and the change took place through this institutional modification. Here we find that the Aryan migrations took place not through the violent dislocation of peoples, but rather through a strategic modification of their social institutions, including their religion, language, government, economics, and caste structure. During their migrations, the Aryan missionaries, each an initiate of the native Aryan mystery tradition, originally termed the Institutes of Manu, would weave their system of philosophy into the framework of religious mythology already existing within the remnant Atlantean groups they encountered. Through this means, the Aryan initiates worked together to generate a new modified system of religious mythology within the post-Atlantean cultures they encountered. Ones that would feature encoded into their core doctrine the Aryan wisdom teachings. So they would move in, change, or remold or redesign the old pattern into something that resembled the archetypal Aryan wisdom teachings, or from the Institutes of Manu. In this way, the Aryan missionaries sought to build around the remnant Atlanteans the architecture of a new institutional environment, one which would stimulate and work upon their developing psyches in a new way so as to draw out latent powers and potentials previously held dormant within them. The classical civilizations of the Mayans, Greeks, Egyptians, Celtics, Persians, and others were generated as a result of this process. Each was composed of an alchemical mixture of ancient peoples, and each made great accomplishments according to their own peculiarities and temperaments. Here we come now to the Americas. The evolution of culture here began with Atlantis, but was gradually modified by the incoming influence of the various Aryan missionaries, who gradually modified their culture over a period of time using the strategy outlined above. Throughout the extended time period during which the Aryan migrations were taking place across the world, the American continents and the surviving Atlantean peoples living here were set apart from their counterparts on the conflict-ridden Eurasian continent on the other side of the world. Consequently, in the Americas, civilization developed a different and more peaceful personality than that which was developing across the Eurasian continent, where civilization groups were constantly interacting with one another, both in cooperation and conflict. As Manly Hall writes, here, on the great western continent, separated from all wars, strife, and discord, untouched by political intrigue and military corruption, stood a virgin area in the midst of a world tearing itself to pieces over a period of thousands of years. The vast ocean separating America from its counterparts in Eurasia made the western continent an ideal testing grounds for the Aryan missionaries to use in order to experiment with and iterate upon Plato's ideal of a philosophic democracy. Through the influence of the cult of the feathered serpent, the native mystery tradition of the Americas, which originated in Atlantis but later came under Aryan influence, the civilizations of the Maya in Central America and the Inca of South America were raised up and established as experimental socialist utopias. In both cases, a common pattern was evidenced. An initiate of the Aryan mysteries, accompanied by a retinue of priests who served him, moved into a region populated by tribal peoples who had, after the collapse of a previous cycle of empire, lapsed back into a primitive state of barbarism. This migrating priesthood, guided by their enlightened adept teacher, assimilated themselves into these tribes and gradually worked to modify their government, economy, culture, and religion into a new design expression, one that reflects the ideals and purposes of the Aryan mysteries. In the process of setting up their system, the Aryan missionaries labored with local tribal peoples and worked to establish a high standard of civilization among them. In this way, primitive tribal peoples living in a Stone Age pattern were transformed in a matter of a few generations into a civilized people performing agriculture, creating art, and generating culture to a degree not seen in the region for many ages. The last recorded example of this pattern of the cult of the feathered serpent being resurrected in the Americas in order to establish an experimental socialist utopia is with the coming of the Aryan adept Manco Capac into the region of Peru around the 10th century AD, where he founded the peaceful and socialistic empire of the Inca. After the gradual decline of the Inca Empire, which thrived between the 10th to 14th centuries AD, high civilization in the Americas went dormant. It awaited its next injection of inspiration, which came in the form of Francis Bacon and his Rosicrucian Brotherhood, who moved into the Americas from Europe alongside a number of other European powers and interests, many in conflict with them, during the 17th and 18th centuries. As we'll be exploring in this article and in future parts of this series, there is a tremendous amount of evidence that during the early decades of the 17th century, Francis Bacon's Invisible College was quietly relocated from its headquarters in England and Germany into North America at the point of its first colonization. We should pause and note that it was not the Baconian group that destroyed the Native American populations. It was those same adversaries that Europe's esoteric schools had been at war with over the course of centuries, these being the three-headed Cerberus, or three-headed adversary of the church, monarchs, and bankers. Actually, Bacon's Rosicrucian and Freemasonic fraternities would have been natural allies of the Inca, Maya, and Iroquois people. But a union between them was never able to be established, as the Native American populations were wiped out almost immediately upon their first contact with Europe's hostile and belligerent colonizers. The fall of these civilization groups left the project of building an American republic to the Rosicrucians and their subsidiary group, the Freemasons. The secret mission of the Rosicrucians and Freemasons in America was to quietly assimilate themselves into the structure of the American colonies, changing them from within, moving them from a colony of the crown to an independent democratic republic, an autonomous nation state which was to be the model for the whole world to eventually mimic and follow in its image. As we will further explore in a future article of this series, it was the Rosicrucians and Freemasons, two Bacon-backed secret societies, who seeded the ground for the American Revolution and the establishment of a democratic commonwealth in North America. According to Bacon's own stated beliefs, America is the site where the Aryan dream of a worldwide philosophic empire is finally to be set up and formally established. This philosophic empire is to become the new Atlantis. This philosophic empire is to come about through the special instrument created to bring it into actuality, the United States of America. Through this nation, the previous iterations of democratic and socialist utopias that have been experimented with here in the Americas over the course of millennia will be synthesized into their final perfected form. The achievement of this final alchemical transmutation of society into the Aryan ideal of the philosophic empire is the secret destiny of America. This transmutation must first take place within the nation of the United States. Then, through a transmuted America, the philosophic empire will extend its reach across the globe, forming a worldwide democratic commonwealth of nations as a result. By this means, the new Atlantis will blossom forth, and the grand destiny of the Aryan stage of human evolutionary existence will finally come into being. And that's the end of that section. Once again, that was called America's Place in the Cycle of the Arya. So next we're going to be looking at the third section of this article. It's called The Aryan Migrations Come to Peru. So this is where we're moving into the second stage of this article. So having done this introduction about the Arya and the role that America plays, we're going to look at how the Aryan migrations came into America at an earlier point before the arrival of Bacon's secret society. It had come earlier to Peru to found the Incan Empire. And this happened originally around the 10th or 11th centuries AD. So not that long ago, actually. And the Inca are the culture who built the very famous Machu Picchu, and they operated in Peru. And I would love to go visit those areas sometime. All right, next section, the Aryan migrations come to Peru. Francis Bacon's vision for how the core institutions of the philosophic empire should function, at least in their ideal state, was transparently revealed by him in his allegorical short story, New Atlantis, published in 1626. As covered in our previous chapter, Francis Bacon's highly esoteric novel discusses the existence of an idealized utopian nation featuring at its core a thriving mystery school termed Solomon's House. Notably, Solomon's House, which he also called the College of the 6 Days' Work, shares many features characteristic of America's native cult of the feathered serpent, which had previously flourished within the great Maya and Inca empires of the past. In fact, in his short story New Atlantis, Bacon makes a number of interesting and significant statements that allude to the fact that he, in early 17th century England, somehow possessed knowledge concerning the existence of a previous Golden Age era of civilization in America. It is quite mysterious how Bacon came to possess this knowledge, given that it would later take scientists hundreds of years to confirm certain statements he made back in the early 1600s concerning the legacy of high civilization in the Americas. Regarding Bacon's mysterious statements about America, Manly Hall notes that in his short story New Atlantis, a high priest of his fictional mystery school, Solomon's House, which is actually an allegorical representation of his Rosicrucian fraternity, makes a considerable speech describing the origin of his nation. In this address, there are a number of interesting and significant statements. For one, the governor describes the great Atlantis that you call America, he says. So he associates America and Atlantis. Later, he constellates the said country of Atlantis with the existence of an empire in Peru, then called Coya, as well as one in Mexico, then named Tirembel. Like the lost empire of the Atlanteans, he notes that each were mighty and proud kingdoms in arms, shipping, and riches. Commenting on this passage, Hall notes that the oldest and highest culture of the Peruvians was that of the Kaluas, which was pronounced Coya. Meanwhile, Tirembel references an almost prehistoric age or stage of high Mayan civilization in Central America. How could Bacon have gained access to knowledge about these ancient cultures? Hall wonders if the philosophic institution that Bacon revealed in his utopian novel, Solomon's House, was one patterned after schools of learned men flourishing on the Western Hemisphere long before the navigations of the Spaniards. He writes that learned societies certainly existed among the Aztecs, Mayas, and Incas. It would seem that in some way Bacon had become aware of these institutions, as there is much in his New Atlantis reminiscent of the great American Indian civilizations of Central and South America. In part one of this series on America, we investigated one of these two ancient high civilizations of the Americas, the Maya of Central America. Now, in this article, we'll be unpacking the story of the other, the Inca of Peru. The heyday of the Inca took place a few centuries before the birth of Francis Bacon, stretching from approximately the 11th to 14th centuries AD. It's worth pointing out that their golden age took place near the same time period that the Templars were working to transfigure Europe under the nose of the Roman Catholic Church. It was during this same time period, halfway around the world, that Manco Cápac, the great Aryan adept, came into Peru and raised up the Incan Empire, elevating it to a very advanced state, one reminiscent of the great Mayan Empire that had previously existed in Central America over 1,000 years before. Elaborating on the Inca origin story, Manly Hall writes that the founder of the Inca dynasty of Peru was the initiate statesman Manco Cápac, who flourished in the 11th century AD. Coming into the area, Manco Cápac's mission was to reform the social and religious life of the tribes of the Aymara Quechua race, who then occupied the region of Peru. In the capital city Cusco, which he built, Manco Cápac established the religion of the sun. He was a statesman of ability and claimed to be a direct descendant of the sun god, a title he shared with Plato, Pythagoras, and all the other great adepts of history. Summarizing his legacy, Hall writes that Manco Cápac emerges as one of the world's outstanding social reformers, with a vision thousands of years ahead of his time. According to Manly Hall, Manco Cápac was born from a small wandering band of migrants who had originally traveled to Peru from Asia, presumably Japan, at an unknown time. So that's notable. And that's something you don't normally hear about, that it wasn't a colonization effort, but there was like a missionary, a sort of type of almost like a Buddhist missionary effort. Although we can't say it was purely Buddhist, but it was definitely inspired by the original Aryan lineage of wisdom teachings. It came over from Asia eastward into Peru and founded the Incan Empire, or that Manco Cápac was derived from a lineage that anyway extended from that origin. So Manco Cápac brought with him the Phoenix, meaning the Aryan mystery school tradition, and reestablished the cult of the feathered serpent among the Peruvian people. The details of the story are not well understood, but Hall makes it clear that Manco Cápac and the caste of Incan priests that he led to prominence in Peru originally derived their esoteric doctrines from a source tradition tracing back to the original Aryan mystery schools of North Asia, the Institutes of Manu. Hall therefore emphasizes that Manco Cápac was an Aryan missionary, something like a Buddhist adept. As he once wrote, there can be no doubt that the Peruvian culture was heavily influenced by symbols, rituals, and philosophical elements usually associated with the Trans-Himalaya area of Central Asia. And the story of Manco Cápac and the rise of the Inca is where we're going to pick up next. That's the next section. All right, Manco Cápac and the rise of the Inca. In his 1946 article, Manco Cápac, the Great Initiate of the Incas, Manly Hall offers further details about Manco Capec's initial entrance into Peru and his encounters with the native tribes of the region. Here he writes that, at some point during the 11th century, we dimly perceive a wandering band of Asiatics, in number only a few hundred, traveling southward along the coast of what is now Colombia and Ecuador. It would seem that these wanderers were long removed in time from their eastern homeland, but they carried with them enshrined in their hearts the splendor of distant places and the language of their remote motherland. The original leader of this expedition or migration was a man named Atua or Atau, I can't quite tell, of whom we know nothing but the name. The migrant band paused for a time on an island called Guayua near the shore of Ecuador, and here Manco Capec was born. His actual birth name was A.R. Manco, with the prefix A.R. referring to his status as a descendant of the Aryan lineage. Hall continues the story. From the native legends, it would seem that A.R. Manco journeyed in a southeasterly direction through the mountains to the areas of Lake Titicaca, which is where he first came into prominence. According to the legends, A.R. Manco established his culture without violence or any conflict with the native Peruvians. He appeared to them as a glorious being from another world. He shone like the sun and possessed great dignity and magnificence of person. He was accepted as the reappearance of one of their ancient deities, probably Pacacamac, who I'm going to be explaining further about later. But he was probably the reappearance of one of these deities and was received with friendliness and trust. The Inca priesthood that A.R. Manco led into Peru were called the People of the Sun. They established the city-state Cusco as the center of their civilization. Hall emphasizes that the Inca were not a race, but a dynasty of rulers who governed the Peruvian nation for about 350 years. This dynasty moved into the region as an outside force. In the process, they brought with them a foreign language and knowledge of arts and sciences entirely new and strange to the Indians of the Andes. As Manly Hall explains, they arrived at a time when a previous pre-Inca empire was slowly disintegrating from internal causes. With a true spirit of opportunism, the Incas grasped the reins of government and implemented their own philosophy of life upon the bewildered natives. With consummate skill, they proceeded to bind their subjects into a strong religious, political, and social unit. Hall writes that Manco Capec's first task would have been to preach to the people of the region his new evolved doctrine of religious philosophy. He states that, quote, "A new leader must always cope with the old gods, for they are deep in the soul and subconscious of their believers." In the case of the pre-Inca Peruvians, their old system of religious mythology was rooted around the worship of a great father god, Kan, and his son, Pacacamac. Hall describes the deity Kan as a pure spirit without any material form, limitation, or dimension. Philosophically, this god seems to have been concerned primarily with the cosmic forces which brought the universe into manifestation. Like Brahma, the father god of the Hindus, no temples or shrines were built to him, for the reason that creation itself was the only appropriate symbol of his power. Pacacamac, meanwhile, was revered as the son of Kan. He was the living god who bestowed the breath of life by an impulse of the will. As Hall explains, this heavenly father united his energies with Pacamama, the earth mother, and from their union sentient life came into being. Like the sky father of the North American Indians, Pacacamac loved and protected his children and ruled over them from the sky, speaking to them through their hearts and through the priests who were his servants. In their religious mythologies about Pacacamac, these primitive Peruvians encoded an account of the deluge. According to these myths, Hall informs us that in the course of time, the hearts of the people were hardened away and they no longer obeyed the will of the heavenly spirit Pacacamac. To punish the creation which had wandered from his laws, Pacacamac sent a deluge to destroy them. After the Great Oblivion, the Creator resolved to fashion a new kind of creature, so his spirit descended upon the city of Tiwanaku, which was therefore venerated as the place of the new creation. Here, Pacacamac made a number of little figures out of clay, each one different, according to their races and nations. He painted upon each the clothing it should wear, and marked their features with peculiarities. Then he bestowed upon each a language and songs to gladden their hearts, and he supplied to each seeds to plant in the ground suitable for the environment they should inhabit. Then he breathed life and soul into each of the little clay figures and told them to enter caves, that is, to go down into the earth. He also ordered them to become civilized and in time to grow out of their caves and come forth into the light of the upper world. This pre-Inca body of myth had originally been brought into the region by a great spiritual teacher named Viracocha at an early point in time, perhaps as far back as 3000 BC. Elaborating on this earlier culture hero of Peru, Manly Hall writes that the great culture hero of the Aymara Quechua people was Viracocha. He was a child of the sky gods and embodied the powers and virtues of Pachacamac, his heavenly father. In Peru, Viracocha founded a mystery school and, through its initiates, worked to raise civilization up to a very high level of attainment, a miniature golden age. Like the hero gods of other cultural groups, Viracocha was said to have appeared on several occasions when humanity was in great trouble. In each case, he took on a form so as to mingle with men and teach them by words and examples. He was represented as a man with a beard and possessed the power to work miracles. He taught the people to love one another and to establish harmonious community life. In a familiar story found in other culture myths, the hero Viracocha, after residing with his chosen people for a period, eventually departs, but only after first promising that if his people would keep his laws, then one day he would return and restore them to a state of glory. After his departure, Viracocha's legacy priesthood was able to temporarily maintain a well-ordered state of civilization, but eventually entropy took over and civilization fell apart. According to Hall's records, this cultural decline took place within Peru around the 6th century AD, a time period that is also associated with the onset of the Dark Age in Europe. During this period, the Peruvian nation entered into a period of decline and disorder, with things falling to such a state that even writing and literacy were lost. Hall states that the sequence of events which brought about this turn of events was a matter of politics, with Viracocha's descendants becoming opposed by a war-making cult loyal to an old order of racial gods. As part of a strategy to eradicate their foes and to consolidate their power, this oppositional sect, once they gained political control, banned writing and attempted to eradicate the legacy of Viracocha. Note that a similar turn of events took place in Europe with the Roman Catholic Church, where, in their attempt to overthrow the old pagan mystery schools, they treated literacy as heretical and destroyed much of the literature originally produced by the old pagan philosophical schools. After the onset of the age of colonization, they did the same thing to the Maya, Aztecs, and Inca, systematically eradicating all records of the old mystery religion that once flourished there. After an extended period of dark ages, in which the Peruvian peoples had fallen back into a primitive state, having lost their previous state of literacy and culture, the Inca, led by Manco Capac, moved into the region and took control, reestablishing civilization. Hall writes that the AR Incas, as they are called, appear to have been of Aryan stock. The Japanese believed that this lineage originally came from their lands, having donated a statue of Manco Capac to the Peruvians in the 1950s to commemorate this idea. In any case, the circumstances by which this foreign people reached the coast of South America has never been clearly defined. Historians have given various estimates for Manco Capac's date of birth and the subsequent founding of his city-state at Cuzco. Manly Hall points to sometime around the 11th century AD for the nation's founding. Once established, it would last for approximately 350 years, providing the Peruvian people with a miniature golden age. So that's the end of that section. And once again, that was the rise of the Inca and the story of Manco Capac. We're going to pick this up further in the next section, which is called the religious philosophy of the Inca. Manly Hall writes that Manco Capac was a statesman of unquestionability. As leader of the Inca, his first task was to wipe out the old feuds of the Peruvians by which the nation had been torn for centuries. His position as a divine being enjoying universal veneration made this task possible. Hall continues, writing that it is difficult at this distant time to estimate the mentality of Manco Capac. We know that it was necessary for him to A. adapt his own teachings and convictions to the requirements of the Peruvian temperament, B. maintain prestige in order to retain control, and C. answer the questions of the natives in a language which they could understand. Analyzing the solution that Manco Capac came up with, Hall comments that his approach to the problem was definitely Asiatic, and was illustrative of the hallmark method that the wandering Aryan sages have all used since the beginning of their migrations. As Hall further details, A.R. Manco's method of colonizing the native peoples of Peru was to reason, arbitrate, and gradually turn public opinion toward the ends which he desired. For example, when questioned concerning his attitude toward the great deities Kan and Pachacamac, A.R. Manco explained patiently that Kan and Pachacamac were great heroes of the earlier ages. They were messengers sent by the great spirit of the world to teach and govern the children of men. It was right and proper that these prophets of God should be honored and their old laws respected and obeyed. But now the secret god had sent to them a new teacher, one of the same divine line. He had come not to destroy the old way, but to perfect it, and thereby bring greater wisdom and honor to the race of the Peruvians. Manco Capac was true to his word. He restored the best that had preceded him, and built upon the older footings the lofty structure of his own empire. He restored and reformed the religion, rewrote the laws and statutes of the people, and conferred upon them the knowledge of a variety of arts, crafts, and sciences previously unknown or forgotten. He then paved the way for those who came after him, and bestowed upon his successors an integrated program of personal leadership and collective government. Like the great Buddhist initiates of Asia, who seeded their doctrines into a variety of culture groups throughout the East, the Incas never encouraged the worship of their own persons. There was only one God, and they were the prophets and servants of that God. Consequently, although Manco Capac was deified as an embodiment of virtue and wisdom, his person was never regarded as divine. While his subjects raised altars in his honor and built similar shrines to his successors, the people accepted the Incas themselves as normal men. In their view, these illustrious mortals deserved honor because of the numerous and beneficial works which they performed. They led by example, in other words, and were celebrated as heroes and role models for the people to follow and imitate. But they were not God, and their followers were instructed not to worship them as idols. Instead of drawing attention to themselves, the Inca taught the native Peruvians that the proper symbol and emblem of the Supreme One was the sun. Consequently, all worship should be directed through the symbol of the sun to the mighty spirit which dwelt in the innermost parts of universal nature. To the Inca, the sun symbolizes the power of universal light, which in turn represents the invisible light of a vast universal spirit, unnamed and unknown. Like the cross of the Christian, it is the symbol of a mystery that lies beyond the world of form. Elaborating on the Inca system of religious philosophy, Hall writes that the Incas recognized a world soul, which was called He Who Animates All Things. This concept corresponds to the secret God, whose worship is universal. Among the Peruvians, the ancient deity Pachacamac remained to the end this secret God. He alone animates the universe and continues its existence. But as he cannot be seen, he is known as the unknown God, an invisible and immaterial being. Consequently, the name Pachacamac was a symbolic placeholder for something so venerable that it could not be spoken. There was no symbol or figure to represent it, but certain titles and words were employed as substitutes for the nameless name. Both the Incas and their people venerated this hidden god more than they revered either the sun or its golden symbol. This hidden god stood behind the mask of the solar face. None could look upon him and live, but all could contemplate his works. Like Bacon, the Inca taught that in beholding the works of the Creator, we come to know the universal goodness which descends from his spirit. To the Peruvians, Manco Capac came to them as the light bearer, meaning he was a servant of the principle of illumination. As the sun was to the heavens, so the Inca was to the earth. Together, Pachacamac, Viracocha, and Manco Capac formed three tiers of one interconnected spiritual hierarchy. Pachacamac was the divine father, Viracocha the divine child, and Manco Capac the Holy Spirit or comforter. The first two of these divinities manifested themselves in ancient times. Pachacamac had created the world, while Viracocha had brought love and beauty to the creation. And in the last days, Manco Capac came to restore, purify, and lead his people in the paths of righteousness. That's from Manly Hall. So that wraps up this section that's called The Religious Philosophy of the Inca. And next we're going to be moving into the Incan model of social governance. All right, the Incan model of social governance. The high priests of the Inca were granted near total power over the society they founded. Hall notes that Manco Capac was relatively constrained in what he could accomplish with the native Peruvian peoples, for the reason that the disposition of his subjects was that of a primitive tribal peoples with little natural inclination for routine or organized industry. This situation prompted that Manco Capac and his disciples form a model of government that was borderline dictatorial and autocratic. But, as Hall points out, this was strategically necessary for the time and place, as only a strict leadership could attain the desired end in a reasonable length of time. The Inca leaders therefore found it necessary to create a high degree of regimentation intimately bound to the religious life of the populace. What resulted was something like a religious autocracy, one rooted in the Aryan religious philosophy of its founder. Like Akhenaten before him, the political ruler of the Inca Empire was simultaneously the king of the people and the high priest of the sun cult. As such, he was revered as the spiritual father of the entire state. The term Inca indicates the ruling caste of priests, aristocrats, and statesmen that together governed the Peruvian Golden Age of the 11th to 14th centuries AD. To become a true Inca, one had to be an initiate of the mystery school Manco Capac originally founded in the region. The initiates of this Incan mystery school were known for their magical prowess, prophetic powers, and telepathic ability. They were also the master artificers behind the construction of the empire's great monolithic temple complexes. From an administrative standpoint, the Incan Empire was run through a highly organized state bureaucracy which was responsible for collectively managing an elaborate socialistic economic system. In the society built by the Inca, there was no finance or capitalism. Instead, the economic system was entirely egalitarian and socialistic. One might even say communistic. Private property did not exist among the people. Because there was no private property, no unequal distribution of resources, and no incentive to accumulate and hoard wealth, there was no crime in Inca society. From a political and economic standpoint, the Inca were overseen by a body of governors who together managed, like a modern corporation, a hierarchy of lesser officials, or mid-management, who in turn oversaw family collectives. Within this council of governors existed a parliamentary House of Lords type tribunal. This was involved in steering the course of Inca society over the long term. The members of this tribunal were initiates of the state religion, the sun cult. As such, they utilized astrological methods fine-tuned by their priesthood in order to plan the course of their empire, a task which they conducted down to the level of the individual citizen. As Hall elaborates, the plan of government was astronomical. The country was distributed like a solar system, with the nobility serving as the material equivalents of the heavenly bodies. Life itself was a ritual, and the gods were served by the useful works of men. With this system of astrological governance put in place, the Inca, from their great throne at Cusco, established a great religious empire based on socialistic principles, one that would peacefully rule the lands of Peru for almost 350 years. Summarizing the lasting legacy of the Inca's great spiritual leader, Arya Manco, Manly Hall writes, Manco Capac was one of the great teachers of the Aryans. Like other world teachers, prophets, and priestly kings, he was one of the golden line of human benefactors who have brought civilization to far places. With agriculture set up as its economic base, supported by an ingenious system of irrigation which was set up among the people, A.R. Manco instigated among the Peruvian people a broad program of social organization. He built cities which he connected with good roads, and he set up a national army with which to defend his little state from barbarous tribes which practiced banditry. He encouraged the study of medicine and astronomy and is regarded as the patron of music and art. In conclusion, Hall writes that as the founder of a great religion, the builder of a vast empire, and a teacher of the esoteric doctrines of the East, this son of the sun, Manco Capac, or A.R. Manco, has a rightful place among the brothers of light. Again, that's from Manly Hall. All right, so that ends that section on the Incan model of social governance. Next up, we're going to look at we're going to begin transitioning into an investigation of the themes involved with the rise and decline of the Inca Empire. So this next section is called "With Isolation Comes Entropy and Inertia." So now we're going into with analysis of the idea that with isolation comes entropy and inertia. While America is known as the homeland of democracy, this elevated state of human affairs was not able to be implemented by the Inca within their Peruvian empire. Further generations would have been needed for the collective state of the Peruvian people to have risen to the level where they could have maintained the institution of democracy within their social structure. Consequently, the empire remained under the old Atlantean foundations of a theocratic autocracy ruled by a priest king, with the temple and its priesthood serving as the central administrative body of the state. For a time, the Inca leadership class was able to maintain the high standard of civilization originally established for it by Manco Capac. But in time, these standards began to lapse, and the state mysteries no longer produced the level of initiate that they once had. Manly Hall emphasizes that philosophic superiority cannot be bestowed. Instead, it must be first earned and then preserved. If the populace ceases to offer from among its body new initiates for the mysteries to perpetuate themselves through, and if society or the populace ceases to uphold the high moral and ethical standards mandated by the priesthood, then the orenda, or spirit power, through which civilization is maintained is dissipated. This was the theme of what we talked about in the previous article. The dissipation of energy within a system is, in physics, associated with the principle of entropy. From a philosophic standpoint, entropy is the impersonal, inevitable adversary of life. Once it sets in, it works to dissipate energy and deconstruct compound forms, dissolving them back to their base elements so that from them new forms can be constructed. Due in large part to the slow but inevitable work of entropy upon their social pattern, with the passing of time, the Inca dynasty followed the oldest of all human patterns, a decline into selfishness and corruption. Manly Hall states that there were 11 Incas in descent from Manco Capac to Huayna Capac, the final heir of the dynasty who died shortly before the Spanish conquest. By the time Huayna Capac came to the throne, the empire had already passed its zenith and was sorely afflicted with internal strife. All this had taken place even before its conquest by Pizarro, with Incan society having already declined by the time the Spanish conquistador arrived there. Following the classic pattern evidenced by all empires, Rome being a notable example, it was not until after social decay and internal rot had first set in that Incan society became vulnerable to takeover and capture. In the case of the Inca, after the last in the line of Manco Capac, Huayna Capac, died in 1525 of disease, perhaps, Manly Hall points that it could have come from a secret plot from the Spanish, a civil war broke out over who would take over inheritance of the throne. His first son, the natural inheritor of the throne, unexpectedly passed away soon after Huayna Capac died. This left his second son to his place. But rising to contest him stood an illegitimate son of Guayanas, who waged civil war and took the crown. Hall states that this illegitimate son, named Atahualpa, was the ruler who had just come to power when Pizarro and the Spanish came. Here he cautions that had it not been that the Incas were quarreling among themselves and engaged in a disastrous civil war, it is very doubtful if the Spaniards could have secured a foothold in their land. Beneath the surface of these domestic antagonisms was the quiet presence of entropy, continually pulling at the fabric of Incan society, waiting for the right time for the people to reveal their vulnerabilities so that it could take control. Hall points out that the isolation of the Inca civilization made it especially vulnerable to the gradual working of entropy. As we pointed out earlier, civilization in the Americas was kept isolated from developments taking place within other culture groups rising in Eurasia. This isolation brought both benefits and detriments. On the plus side, it provided space for peaceful empires in the model of Bacon's New Atlantis to flourish without threat of invasion from a competing empire. But isolation also prevented the influx of outside stimulation and inspiration from entering into these societies, stimulation necessary to prevent crystallization from setting in among the psyche of its peoples. Hall suggests that ultimately the extensive communal civilization of the Peruvians failed for lack of a constant testing of its way of life. He states that the dynasty of the Incas was built up without consideration for the possibility of foreign entanglements. It was a theoretical state that survived only until it received the impact of a practical problem. The Incas realized too late that they had made no provision to meet the challenge of a highly organized competitive polity, personified by the Spaniards under Pizarro. Unfamiliar with the history of empires ravaging the Eurasian continent over the course of millennia, the peace-loving Inca could not fathom the dishonesty or greed exhibited by the Spaniard conquistadors. The Inca were used to a completely different mode of psychology than the Spaniards. For example, Manly Hall points out that the Incas did not execute captives or prisoners of war. Instead, they were sent to the outskirts, given an allotment of land, civilized, and in time made citizens of the empire with full rights and privileges. In Europe, by contrast, the political environment was much closer to kill or be killed. From a Darwinistic standpoint, there was a certain advantage to having undergone the type of competitive experience that the Europeans had been used to going through over the course of millennia. Eurasia's environment of constant competition between empires resulted in the institutionalization of certain attributes which came to provide a competitive advantage for them in relation to peoples existing in other continents. These hard-earned attributes, ones that the Europeans had cultivated within themselves as the result of constant conflict, include strength, hardness, perseverance, guile, and desperation, qualities largely absent among the comparatively peaceful Inca peoples. When confronted by these shadow elements of their own psyche, which appeared to them through the persons of the conquistadors, the Incas lacked the means to effectively cope or respond. Their psychology had become crystallized into its older and familiar isolationist pattern. And when the Spaniards arrived at last as a challenger to it, the Inca civilization collapsed almost immediately. Analyzing the situation further, we see that the Inca, isolated from the world, were not functioning as an open system. Therefore, they became vulnerable to the workings of crystallization and inertia, with deep-rooted psychological and institutional patterns setting in and becoming solidified to the point where they became brittle and inflexible to change. Outside stimulation and pressure is required to keep human psychology honest with itself. Without such pressure, internal discipline can fail, leading first to decadence and then to various other evils, which accumulate and metastasize like cancers within the social organism. Like all energetic systems, civilization needs a constant input of stimulation and inspiration to maintain discipline. In some cases, to catalyze growth, the presence of an adversary is necessary. It forces the system to take stock of itself and focus on its own growth and progression, rather than sitting back and being content with itself. Elaborating on the situation, Hall writes that while the American Indian cultures were drifting along in the comparatively paradisiacal region of the West, Europe and Asia were fighting the long, bitter battle of survival. Eurasian civilization has advanced always in relation to confrontation with shadow factors, with one civilization always existing in relation to other competing powers around it, each testing, stimulating, and inspiring the growth of its counterparts. While this state of constant strife and pressure did not make the European good or wise, from an ethical, moral, or spiritual standpoint, it did make him powerful in his offenses and defenses when it came to the topic of empire. As Manly Hall notes, the European, quote, became wise in the ways of survival and quick to take advantage of the weaknesses of his adversaries. Furthermore, the stimulation brought from constant confrontation with outside hostile powers forced the leaders of European society to stay grounded in the geopolitical realities of life. For example, the outside threats of Islam and the Mongolian Empire of Genghis Khan served as powerful checks and balances on the decadence of Christendom during the Dark Ages of Europe. By contrast, civilization in the Americas lacked these type of interactions and suffered as a consequence. They deteriorated because their security was not assailed by any foreign powers. Hall states that isolation and the security of an invincible position both lead to rapid decline. He continues, growth is a result of pressure. The human being does not choose to improve and cannot be induced to become great from motives of character and conviction alone. The moment pressure is removed, man relapses into a state of indolence and indifference. To further emphasize the point, Hall points out that a similar fate befell the Maya. Their isolation led to crystallization, which in time led to their downfall. Hall writes that had the Mayas been able to establish an early contact with Europe and had they grown up with the experiences of other nations, there might have been a magnificent and unconquerable civilization in the Western Hemisphere, one more powerful than the states of Europe. But instead the Maya were out of the current. Alone they lived, and by the very tragedy of aloneness, they perished. Gradually their incentives failed so that their history contains no indication of advancement beyond a certain level. Instead, there was a gradual decay, with the Aztec Empire eventually forming in its wake, but this was a lesser expression of the Maya. So they attempted to resurrect the glory days of the Maya, but were never entirely successful and ultimately experienced the same fate as their ancestors. Overall, because of the isolation that the Americas experienced, a dry rot, or entropy, and inertia closed in slowly around its civilizations like the inevitable encroachments of the jungle. Gradually, entropy, inertia, and crystallization set in and began deconstructing all that had previously been built, until nothing remained but the magnificent ruins that the Spaniards found when they arrived. Hall notes that this same dynamic also informed the fall of the Iroquois nation discussed in our previous article. He writes that the North American Indian tribes remained comparatively isolated and unsocialized until European immigration threatened the survival of these scattered groups. Only under the impact of this direct threat to common survival did these nomadic tribes begin a program of unification and confederation. This might have brought with it a successful concept of empire had the European colonists been less energetic in their policies. But by the time the Europeans arrived en masse, it was too late. Therefore, just as with the Inca, Maya, and Aztecs, the lack of competition or any common danger retarded the advance of the northern tribes. So that's the end of that section. That, once again, was called With Isolation Comes Entropy and Inertia. And you can see how this was a constant theme in the Americas. And suggests why it was that the Europeans came in and sort of effortlessly conquered the populations of the Americas, the native populations. So moving on, the next section is called From Race to Nation, and we're going to be going further into the dynamics that were involved in this transition between the Native American tribes to gradually the colonization and the bringing of the Western way of life into the Americas. All right, picking things back up, we're going to be going into the dynamics of race, the psychological dynamics. As covered previously, the Inca Empire was built as a socialist state governed by a centralized religious authority. Surveying the model of social governance they implemented, we find that the Inca successfully fulfilled the socialistic ideals of the philosophic empire archetype, but they were not able to successfully implement its political ones. Meaning they never developed democratic institutions and instead crystallized into an inflexible theocracy. For this reason, Inca civilization suffered from the same tendency that modern socialistic states like Soviet Russia or China have also succumbed to. The state comes to dominate the psychology of the individual to the point that the personal growth of individuals becomes retarded as a result. Here we find the individual becoming overly subservient to the state, with him living to serve the state rather than the state existing to serve him. On this point, Manly Hall emphasizes that the individual is not created for the state. Rather, the state is created for the individual. There can be no permanent civilization until the individual becomes strong. The Inca way of life emphasized a highly communal, socialized form of living. While this resulted in a long period of peaceful prosperity for the Incas, it did not result in the development of any strong personal initiative among its people. For centuries, the Inca people had been comparatively regimented and had learned only to obey. Consequently, when the Spanish came into the picture and tested them, capturing their leader, their strong system of state almost immediately collapsed. Why? Because the individual citizen was without any personal experience of personal action. He could not organize himself or his resources. Consequently, when the Spanish conquistadors came and offered a challenge to the stability of the Incan social order, it buckled almost immediately, like a house of sticks blown down by the big bad wolf who had come calling at the door. Besides making them a breeding ground for the negative forces of entropy and inertia, the geographic isolation of the Americas had another negative byproduct. It prevented the mingling of races and cultures. This type of mingling has been the hallmark of Eurasian civilization since the beginning, and particularly since the emergence of the great empires of the Axial Age, which served to mingle together all different types of culture groups in Europe. But in the Americas, this type of mingling did not take place. There was no clash of civilizations for the Native American peoples to be stimulated by. At least there wasn't until the Europeans arrived, at which point it was too late. Because of their isolation, the bloodlines and cultural institutions of the Native Americans were not able to be mingled with other groups in the same way that their European counterparts were. Consequently, the Native Americans remained deeply rooted in a traditional pattern of racial psychology, one originally inherited from the Atlanteans. In philosophy, the working of the subconscious mind is correlated with the flow of blood. Just as one's blood chemistry is inherited through their racial lineage, the psychological archetypes that populate the unconscious dimensions of the psyche can also be inherited from one's racial background. This was especially true of the Atlanteans, but is less true for us today as a consequence of the influence of the Aryan migrations, which have worked to transform the old racial foundations of human life so as to recenter things on a new post-racial concept of nation. The modern psyche has been directed outward into a primarily extroverted mode of existence. This is a detachment from humanity's traditional mode of psychic operation, which began in an introverted mode of expression. As we go back into human prehistory, we find the human psyche increasingly dominated by an introverted mode of thinking. As part of this psychic introversion, elements that we now experience as subconscious or unconscious came to exert a more direct and dominant influence on the psychological functioning of the individual. During this previous stage of psychic introversion, elements that we now experience as subconscious or unconscious came to exert a more direct and dominant influence on the psychological functioning of the individual. Consequently, as we go back in time, we find the archetypes of the collective unconscious playing a comparatively more domineering role in human perception than they do now. These archetypes clothe themselves as racial gods, which the people of ancient society perceived themselves as being inseparably bound to. The racial gods were passed down as a type of inheritance carried forth through the bloodstream just as physical characteristics are. Note that these racial gods were based on archetypes that all people share in common. They only appeared different due to the outer symbolic clothing that was sort of fashioned by the subconscious of each racial group. It was only when the bloodlines of racial groups began to mix, a course of events that was accompanied by the installation of the Aryan institutional pattern across the world, as a result of the work of the missionaries like Manco Capac, that this situation began to change, with the psychology of race now shifting to the psychology of nation. Mankind's original state of psychology was racial, meaning it was introverted, with archetypes clothing themselves in the form of racial gods that the psyche could not detach its perception of life from. As the psyche became increasingly extroverted and ecocentric in orientation, something that has happened as a gradual motion since Atlantean times as a consequence of people becoming detached from their native racial traditions or communities as a result of war, empire, migration, environmental dislocation, etc., this situation began to change. The psyche became liberated from its attachment to its old racial mode of functioning and was freed to carve out an identity for itself. The freedom for self-definition and self-actualization are the gifts bestowed by our current, increasingly post-racial mode of civilization. This freedom did not exist in man's earlier modes of existence. Previously, you were born into a caste position defined by your race, and you lived out the part, embodying the mask of the persona such that you did not see yourself as an individual, but rather as a member of a social unit. This older, caste-based racial mode of psychology is that which prevailed among the Atlanteans. Race is therefore an inheritance from Atlantis. It is something the cycle of the Arya over the course of its many migrations has been gradually working to overcome. As we've discussed, the Atlantean mode of psychology was introverted and interfaced heavily with the domain that Carl Jung called the collective unconscious. To the Atlantean, who possessed a natural capacity for ESP, the inner psychic influences of the collective unconscious played an active role in directing the life of the people. They were more actively aware of this shared dimension of human psychology, and it guided their perception of life in a way that is unfamiliar to us today. Because the working of the subconscious is closely interconnected with the circulation of blood in the body, the maintenance of bloodlines was important to the preservation of Atlantean institutions. For the Atlanteans, the preservation of bloodlines was not just a custom, there was a real psychic consequence for the mixing of blood. Consequently, the bloodlines of races did not mix. To do so was to destroy one's connection with the subconscious foundations of one's racial identity. Delving further into the dynamics of race, Manly Hall points out that race is a physical and psychological force that we inherit. This inheritance is something over which the individual has no control, a circumstance he is born into and forced to deal with and live through. Hall writes, race represents a tremendous pressure of environment. It is something larger than the individual and within which he must function. It is dominated by forces over which he has no control. Hall also associates race with the great involutionary motion of spirit into matter. Through the great pattern of races, entities are ushered into a state of objective existence. It closes around them, limits them more and more, until finally they experience the final manifestation of limitation, which is the sense of isolation. The Aryan root race has since risen to emphasize a different mode of psychology than the Atlantean. With it, the mind's natural ESP powers have gone dormant, and instead the psyche has become directed outward toward its engagement with the physical realities of life. Today, among most humans, the ESP faculties innate to the Atlantean have become crystallized into a latent state. Now the Aryan must actively work to reawaken these powers through the practice of esoteric disciplines. Meanwhile, the outwardly directed Aryan mode of psychology emphasizes the development of the intellect and ego principle to a much greater degree compared with the psyche of the Atlantean. Consequently, the grand mission of the Arya, to establish a world nation, benefits from the mixing of bloodlines, as this helps the subconscious detach from its possession by the inherited memories of one's ancestors, which live on in the blood and exert their influence to the subconscious. Through the Aryan-promoted mixing of racial bloodlines, the subconscious becomes somewhat liberated from its possession by the memories and karma of their ancient racial ancestors. This detachment from the past allows the individual more room to carve out an autonomous psychic identity for themselves. Here we discover that the cycle of the Arya is inherently post-racial. It benefits from the mingling of races and the formation of nations from the compound that results. The Aryan spiritual leaders have always pursued a course of action which seeks ultimately to mix races and bloodlines and form a global nation from this admixture. The Aryan root race first emerged at a point when the old racial bloodlines of Atlantis were still preserved. They moved into the situation with the deliberate goal of mixing these racial groups together. This would take time, but the project has moved down through the ages. In many ways, it culminated with the formation of the United States, which is the first nation deliberately constructed to be the homeland of a diverse mixture of racial groups. The nation is an inherently interracial concept. It is formed from the mingling of racial groups and previously kept apart. Together, they shed their attachment to the past and work to build a better life for themselves and their progeny. Hall points out that while race is inherited, nations are actively built and maintained through the coordinated vision and effort of individual citizens. As Hall describes it, the nation is man's own device, one built from his own evolving interpretation of life rather than upon the inheritance of past traditions. As man grows and his interpretation of life matures, the type and quality of nation that he builds for himself also changes and evolves. Like individuals, nations begin in a primitive state and gradually evolve upward, improving through time via experimentation, observation, and experience. This is the same idea that Daganawida promoted with his Iroquois League of Nations, that the League together formed a living entity which was only kept alive as long as the people worked together and loved each other. Therefore, through experience, nations learn the value of unity. When divided, they inevitably die. And when overly focused on competition instead of cooperation, they inevitably fractionalize and fall apart. For this reason, the evolutionary motion of nations is toward assimilation and integration, with its ultimate goal being the establishment of a world commonwealth of nations, one economically, politically, culturally, scientifically, and religiously united under the guidance of one global institutional system. Esoterically, this global nation can only ever come about through the leadership of the mystery schools. Therefore, at the center of world civilization must reside a global iteration of the cult of the feathered serpent. This is the ideal Plato originally established thousands of years ago with his idea of the philosophic empire and its implementation of world democracy. And it is the same one Francis Bacon re-emphasized in his utopian classic New Atlantis. As Bacon explicitly stated in his utopian novel, America is the New Atlantis. This means that the destiny of the United States is to establish the groundwork for the world nation to take root. Then, as its final act as a nation state, it must give birth to this global institutional order, bringing the world nation about as its special progeny. America's fate is therefore to die to its current form as an imperial nation, so that from the ashes of the current world order, a new institutional paradigm may be born in its place, the world nation, or New Atlantis. And in this article, I have a little table that I put together. I originally had this in the zine from a couple years ago, but I'm going to read this out. So on one column, it says race, and on the other column, it says nation. So we're going to compare each of these across a number of categories. So race is inherited while nation is actively built. Race is rooted in tradition and custom and is thus inflexible, while the nation concept actively innovates, modifies, rebuilds, and renews itself based on evolving needs. It's malleable. Racial karma is inherited from ancestors through the bloodstream. And for the nation, national karma is psychological and results from vibrations set up in national institutions by attitudes and policies. Race is homogeneous, with one group of people linked together and separated from other racial groups. And the nation is heterogeneous, with nations being comprised of a mix of races. And then finally, race is involutionary, as part of the dynamic by which consciousness or spirit moves into matter in order to express itself through the vehicle of living beings. And the nation picks up this inheritance of race, this background, and then it becomes evolutionary, meaning it takes these living beings and then it gradually resynthesizes them together. So evolution is part of the dynamic by which spirit releases itself from its confinement within material form. So those are the differences between race and nation. So race is really the inheritance of Atlantis, and then the nation is the bestowal of the Arya. It's the part of the grand project of the Arya is to bring the nation about. All right, so one more section of this article, and this last section is called The New Atlantis and the Global Nation. All right, final section, The New Atlantis and the Global Nation. Recapping the above, whereas the Atlantean mode of existence developed in the context of the separation of races, the Aryan approach is based on the mixing, mingling, and recombination of racial groups in order that they may come together to form the nation. The ideal for the Arya is the nation, a cosmopolitan entity comprised of a blend of racial groups which interact, reproduce, and recombine to produce a diverse community of people living together to cooperatively build a mode of community existence that each believes in. This is the ideal of the nation. It is the basis of the American way of life, with peoples from different races and backgrounds coming together and collectively forging a democratic nation. Nothing like this existed in Atlantis. Atlanteans were divided into racial groups, with one rising to reign supreme over the others. For this reason, the concept of the interracial nation is the key factor that separates old Atlantis from the Aryan ideal for the new Atlantis. The new Atlantis emerges in the form of the nation, one that is comprised of a mix of races who come together to build a new future for themselves. By contrast, the old Atlantis was individually and collectively tethered to its racial foundations and traditions and was unable to detach itself from them. The Atlantean could not unite in spirit or body with the peoples of other subraces around him because to do so was to destroy his subconscious connection to the memory of his tribal ancestors and the influence of the old gods who lived actively in his psyche. The Atlantean approach was therefore to preserve racial disconnection. By contrast, the Aryan approach is the opposite. It is to reconnect the races and to build something new, the nation, from the compound created when diverse groups of peoples come together and synthesize. The breakthrough social concept of the Aryan Age is the nation. It is an inherently post-racial idea where a mixed-race citizenry continually interacts, mixes, blends together, and synthesizes into a new form of being, a citizen. The citizen of the nation is the individual who voluntarily dedicates himself to the fulfillment of a collective project. To achieve this goal, he must not be dedicated merely to the preservation of the past, but also to the task of continually building and innovating a new and better future for himself and his fellow citizens. In Francis Bacon's vision, the emergence of the post-racial New Atlantis superstate begins with the United States of America, but eventually expands to incorporate the whole world. Mendenhall suggests that only the power of a racially diverse and interblended world nation can overcome the entropy inherent to Atlantean-style racial isolationism. Writing, "No part of the world can come to a condition of lasting security until all the world together shares the experiences which must bring about the maturity of mankind." The nation is the perfect vehicle for bringing about this shared experience of growth. It blends races together and is dedicated to the education of its populace. As Hall elaborates, the nation is a collective organism that is expressed and grows by unfolding, developing, and releasing the potential held within its constituents. Therefore, national development is something that places an ever greater emphasis upon the intelligence of its citizens. In order to develop the intelligence of its citizenry, the nation must invest in education as the basis of its social order, while also providing its populace with career opportunities and challenges well suited to stimulating their internal growth and development. The world nation must be dedicated to education, and its educated populace must be provided with opportunities to use their education in order to perform good, beautiful, and charitable works dedicated to the overall betterment of society as a whole. This is the model Francis Bacon revealed through the mythical society Solomon's House in his utopian novel New Atlantis. Being rooted in education, the world nation must become the philosophic empire, an empire of the wise dedicated to spreading wisdom, intelligence, and beauty to all people across the world. Only through philosophic education can democracy successfully be implemented. A citizenry suffering from ignorance, superstition, and fear can never be free. The new Atlantis that is to arise through America is therefore one that must carry forth not only the ideal of world education, but also that great philosophical tradition native to the Western continent's democracy. The golden age of old Atlantis was the accomplishment of a small elite, a relatively small number of sorcerer magicians who ruled over a large and comparatively primitive population like shepherds guiding their flock. The coming golden age, the new Atlantis, will be different. Now the entire population will participate in building and maintaining the institutions that sustain this philosophic empire, making it great. The new Atlantis we must establish today, the new global empire that we must forge with the mystery schools once again enthroned at its center, must come as a democratic commonwealth, one that promotes philosophy as its dominant ideology and science as the primary basis of its educational program. In the original vision of Plato, the leadership class of the philosophic empire was to be comprised of the philosophic elect, these representing the initiates of the mysteries. Francis Bacon expanded on this concept, adding to this his vision of the scientist priest. the scientist who grounds himself in religion, is trained in philosophy, and utilizes the knowledge and skill obtained by his use of science in order to perform benevolent and charitable works within society. This is something we must make a reality. Our world leaders must be trained and tested in the disciplines of philosophy, and our scientists must be redirected toward using their knowledge for the accomplishment of good and charitable works intended for the benefit of all. By bringing forth the lofty ideals set forth for it by Plato and Bacon, America fulfills what Manly Hall terms its assignment with destiny. Hall writes that the new Atlantis, the world nation, is an archetype, a destiny that was built into us at the beginning of our race. Man is building into a design that has always been. Before the world was formed, the purpose of the world was fashioned. Before the human being had begun experience, the reason for experience was there, moving him, forcing him through pleasure and through pain to the fulfillment of the purpose of his own existence. The new Atlantis, manifesting through the form of the world nation, is this great shared purpose that the Aryan cycle has been gradually pulling mankind toward. It represents the promise of a future golden age, one that America is destined to one day bring forth into the world, once it first successfully confronts and overcomes its shadow, the adversary within itself. And that last line is a bit of a preview of what is to come as we move towards the end of this series on America. But that, for now, is the end of this section and also of the article as a whole. Once again, that was on the theme of the new Atlantis and the global nation. And so I'm taking these themes and I'm revisiting them again and again over the course of these articles, but each time probing them a little bit differently and then connecting them, these themes, with this unfolding story of human civilization, which is explored through the perspective of these various civilization groups and their traditions. So in this article, we looked at the Inca, and we connected it back to this familiar pattern of the Atlantis cycle moving into the Aryan Age. So that is the conclusion of things for today. Thank you for everybody who stuck with it this far, and I hope this is, I know it's maybe a little bit overwritten. I could probably edit this down a little bit, but maybe for the future, if I do a written publication, I'll go back through and do like a edit and see if I can trim some of this down. But I just felt like this whole story was important to tell and to kind of go back over the themes again and again to make sure they get solidified. So that's why this is so long. But just in retrospect, we went over 3 parts. We talked about the cycle of the Arya, then we moved into the Inca as an example of that cycle, and then gradually looked at the larger themes that differentiate the old Atlantis from the new Atlantis. And coming up next is going to be, or the next article in this series is going to be one that is maybe a week or so away. I still am working on finishing the last couple articles. So I hope this will do for now. And check back in with the channel, soon. I'm going to keep this rolling. And then I have things kind of prepared to just jump right into the next chapter. So the last couple of chapters, I'm hoping to just plow my way through and get this book, overall book and thesis and stuff finished. But the last material that I'm going to be going into is kind of like the most exciting because it's stuff that's most contemporary and most relevant for today. It's I've kind of renamed the last couple of chapters and refocused them a bit. So now I'm thinking the next chapter is going to be called A Secret History of the 20th Century. And then the last chapter is going to be focused on the 21st century. So title still TBD on that, but that's kind of where I'm going to offer my analysis of the current moment and then offer my sort of synthesis of things to show how philosophy can be the solution for a lot of these problems and how the sort of ideal, that a shared vision and ideal that we need to re-articulate and it needs to kind of spread within society, the great social movement that we need to have is one that are based around these philosophic ideals that were set out by Plato and Francis Bacon, in my opinion, and Manly Hall, of course. So anyway, that wraps it up. Once again, this is alexsachon. See my website, alexsachon.com. You can find links to everything. And thanks again. God bless.